This is our panel, how we did it and what it took to build an innovation hub. So I'd like to ask our panelists to come up. Let me introduce Joan McDonald, our moderator. Ms. McDonald's a nationally recognized expert in economic competitiveness, sustainable development, and organizational innovation. She's a principal of JMM Strategic Solutions, a former commissioner of the New York State Department of Transportation, and a former commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dean, for those great remarks. I'm going to spend just a few minutes setting the stage for our four great panelists, who most have come in from out of the area, so I think you're going to be very interested to hear what they have to say. I'm going to start out. This week, there was a survey by Politico magazine. It was released on April 25th. And the title of the survey was, Mayors, Flint Could Happen to Us. And some of the findings, even though Politico acknowledged that it was a non-scientific survey, was that 50% of roads, bridges, and water pipes have deteriorated critically over the last 10 years. That is coupled with, in 2013, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded the country's overall infrastructure at a D+. Now, we're here to talk about the technology revolution and how cities have succeeded and some of the lessons learned, but I think it's also important to recognize those basic infrastructure issues. And what the mayors said in this survey was the deterioration will impact economic growth, and they reflected widely. 1/3 of the respondents said the next occupant of the White House should make infrastructure the top urban issue ahead of education and ahead of income inequalities. They said that we need to recognize infrastructure investment equals economic development. But what we've been seeing is a shifting of infrastructure investment from a federal issue to a state and local one. A CBO study, a Congressional Budget Office study done in March, reported that state and local governments spent $320 billion on transportation and water investments, as opposed to the federal government spending $96 billion. Between 2003 and 2014, state and local investments increased 5%, while the federal investment decreased 19%. So we have this interesting dynamic going on where we recognize the federal government is not investing, but we still are calling on them to do more. And this at the same time as we're seeing a shift in demographics. As Dean said, there are 75 million boomers, but there are 83 million millennials, and they represent 25% of the population. And on the positive side, over 500 businesses have relocated to downtowns over the last 5 years, mostly in the tech and the knowledge sector. We're seeing the benefits of smart growth, which is what we are here to talk about today. In walkable urban places, they see a third higher GDP per capita. Smart growth generates 10 times more tax revenue per acre, and they see an average of 10% decline in costs of delivery of service. There are some examples that give us pause to say good things are happening in spite of some of that disinvestment in infrastructure. I'm going to talk about a few, and then the panelists are going to mention a few, and our panelists are really going to go into some of the details of their own experience. In Redmond, Washington, picking up on Dean's point as to how to engage your corporate citizens, Microsoft is investing in infrastructure upgrades. In San Francisco, there's $780 million being invested by private investor equity for affordable housing. Tacoma, Washington, and a private developer are creating a mixed-use district. And Little Rock, Arkansas has credited the Creative Corridor, a project investing $100 million with restoring the city's downtown. Our panel is going to bring their unique successes and their lessons learned so that we can benefit from their experience and also learn what some of the barriers have been. I'm going to introduce each one of them as they speak. The format is going to be each one of them is going to talk for a few minutes and talk about their experience, and then I'm going to raise some questions and leave some time at the end for all of you to ask questions. I'm joined by Jason Widen, Susan Dawson, Mayor Berke, and Seth Pinsky. Our first panelist is Jason Widen. Jason is the co-founder of HQ Raleigh, whose mission is to unleash the impact potential of economics and technology in the Raleigh-Durham area. He was also the executive director of Innovate Raleigh. I was speaking to him before we started and asked him how he ended up in Raleigh. Was he born there? And no, he and his wife were there on a 3-day weekend, and they decided to stay on their place someplace else. So Jason, we're going to start with you.
Great.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. If you build it, they won't come. If you build it, they won't come. What I mean by that is it can't be top down. It's got to be bottom up. It has to be entrepreneur led. How many entrepreneurs do we have in the room today? Raise your hand. Good. If you get nothing else out of what I say today, remember that. It's got to be bottom up. I also encourage you to read Brad Feld's book, Startup Communities, which has really informed us in our community as we've gone and building our entrepreneurial ecosystem. So about 5 years ago, we weren't in too different of a place. Lots of success, great building blocks in our community, a strong life science community, a legacy with RTP, but our community was fragmented, disconnected. There's these disparate communities of highly effective entrepreneurs working, but there wasn't really that connectivity that existed to help propel us forward. So a group of us got together and we held what we called Innovate Raleigh, which is basically a summit of 350 thought leaders, education, government, entrepreneurs, corporations, and we got together and we brainstormed what the entrepreneurial landscape should look like in Raleigh. What are those key building blocks that we need in Raleigh to help catalyze the entrepreneurial ecosystem? Basically a blueprint. What are those key components that we need moving forward? So, really interesting day, and it was mind mapped. So we had a group there that basically took notes and distilled all of this chatter and conversation down, and really to 4 key elements. The first being culture, and Mr. Mooney brought this up earlier, and I think it'll be a common theme today. You got to check your egos. From what I understand, there's a lot of municipalities represented here today. You've got to check your egos. This whole idea of a rising tide floats all boats is real. It was Bob Giolis, who runs RTP in the Triangle, was one of the groups that was mentioned earlier. They're a powerhouse not only in North Carolina, but also throughout the world. They really check their egos, and they're working with someone like me who just moved to the community that was interested in building an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So building a culture where we work together. My mantra has always been, I don't want to replicate, I don't want to duplicate, I want to create value in my community, and that served me very well. The second thing that came out of the conference was this idea of telling our story and communicating effectively. There was a lot of really cool entrepreneurial things happening in our community, a lot of rock stars, but no one knew about it. Not only did we not know about it locally, but we didn't know about it nationally. So what do we do to tell our story, shout it from the mountaintop that Raleigh isn't this boring government center, but we actually have some pretty cool entrepreneurial things happening? The next thing was connecting people to mentorship and capital. We started to survey the landscape and those successful entrepreneurs and business people that lived in the community, and we were astounded. So how do we bring these people and connect them with the startups to help those people grow? Capital is always a big deal. Angel capital, VC money, That's again, that's about storytelling. That's about letting people know that there's a density and deal flow in your community. Extremely important to connect people. Where I come in is the next topic, which is convening space. The group decided that we needed flexible and affordable space where entrepreneurs could come and bump into each other and have those meaningful conversations, to interact with a group of your peers, to have events with like-minded people, to keep that conversation going and how we're going to build and grow the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I would also add sexy space, a space that appeals to a younger generation of the millennials. So as a result, 5 years later, and actually this information just came out at an event I spoke with earlier this week. 5 years on, we have over 500 startups and we've raised $341 million in a 5-year time period. We're also recognized as one of the fastest growing entrepreneurial ecosystems in the country. For me personally, I'm one of the co-founders of one of the largest community building organizations in the Southeast and the largest in North Carolina. We have 300 plus companies and 120,000 square feet. We're developing an additional 60,000 square feet of space, and we're expanding throughout the Southeast. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jason. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the Q&A for Jason because it really is a success story. And as he mentions, it is ground up and it is a combination of people from different backgrounds and different expertise. Our next speaker is Susan Dawson. Susan is an entrepreneur and a civic business leader. She is the founder of E3, which is Education Equals Economics. She is one of Austin's 30 most influential leaders who have helped shape Austin's economy and culture in the past 30 years. And I think it will be important to hear from her how education, as we've been talking about in the workforce, really is an important component of how we move this economy forward. Susan?
Thank you very much. I am here to talk about talent and growing your own workforce and pulling together an entire region, not individual school districts, not individual towns or cities, but how is it that you look across all of Westchester County and say, how do we build our human infrastructure, not just our physical infrastructure, to be able to put together the workforce of the future that your innovation hub is going to build on. I also am an engineer by training and a resident geek, so I thought that a good way to spin this story would be to think about one of the things that we've thought a lot about in the Central Texas area, which is how do you use data as a galvanizing factor? How do you use data as a way to bring together communities to think about our wholeness as opposed to our separateness? How do you think about our entire county's future and use data as the basis to do that? So when we think about data being a powerful tool to lead through influence, and by leading through influence is very important. There's very few of us who can tell everyone in Westchester County what to do. I work in the education sphere. I can't tell college presidents what to do. I can't tell school boards what to do. So how is it that we lead through influence to have a collective impact in our community? One way is we always ensure that the data we have is objective and independent. People have to believe in what we have to say. They have to believe in the data we're going to share. Second is that you use data to enforce a sense of regionalism. And I'll show you an example or two about that where we try not to talk about this school versus that school or this district versus that district, but how are our students, how is our human capital doing as a whole? We also lead with a conclusion, not a description. So for instance, when you look at the information that we share with our communities, we'll never say, here is a projection of achievement gaps across the last 10 years. We'll say, achievement gaps are alarmingly far apart. Or we'll say, our achievement gaps are closing. Tell people what you want them to understand from the information that you're sharing with them. Also use data to tell a story. What is it that you want people to internalize, to humanize from the data that the geeks like I like a lot? And then finally, where possible, because this is especially important for business leaders, is quantify it in monetary terms. How do you tell the story of the return on investment? So I'm going to show 3 examples of some simple ways that we try to use that to drive data, to drive change. So one is building the science, technology, engineering, math pipeline. Now there are lots of different ways to look at STEM careers. In the Central Texas region, even in the down economy, we continue to need computer scientists, electrical engineers. Many parts of the country have a STEM-driven economy. Here, lots of biotech. If we looked at our pipeline of STEM careers, there were lots of gaps and there were lots of assets. So we looked across all from middle school to high school to college to industry. What are the things that we needed to work on to be able to galvanize the pipeline of students in the STEM careers? The most important thing that we did was we pulled together a single number. Our single number was 1,493. That was the number of students when we started this work back in 2008 who were taking engineering-focused classes in high school. 1,493. Now, that didn't mean they're all going to become engineers or technologists, right? But we knew we had 1,493 students in 12 schools to build upon, and we knew each individual school couldn't do anything with their 50 kids or 60 kids or 100 kids, but altogether we had a story to tell. Here's 1,500 students preparing for STEM careers. That allowed us to bring together over 24 industry, higher ed, and K-12 partners to start working on that pipeline. And what we've done since 2008 is taken that pipeline, increased it from that 1,493. Oh, and my value left. Oh, sorry, that's a PowerPoint issue. But we now have 9,500 students in high schools taking engineering classes, over a 600% increase. We can't find that increase anyplace in the country. But it started with that 1,493 because our community said, really, we have something to work upon if we look across the region. Here's another example. Central Texas region, we look at the 5-county area, is about twice as large as the Westchester County area. How many student absences do you think that we had across all of our students last year in Central Texas schools? Does anybody have a guess? How many student absences? Hundreds? Hundreds? If we look all across all students, more than hundreds. 2.4 million. 2.4 million days that a student was absent from school, not able to learn, teacher not able to teach. Also, like many parts of the country, our schools are paid based on students being there. So every single day that a student misses school, they lose money. So we put together the data behind this to help our community understand this. Did you know, again, state by state is different, but about on average in Texas, every time a student is absent, it costs every school $38 a day. That rolls up pretty quickly. The average comprehensive high school loses $20,000 a week just from student absences. Across our region, that's $91 million a year. That allowed us to quantify things. If we improved student attendance just 2 percentage points or 3 days per student per year, that brings $34 million back to Central Texas schools every year. $34 million hires a lot of teachers and builds out a lot of science labs, and because we're Texas, it also hires a lot of football coaches. But what could we do to bring this back? So we started working together to improve student attendance, and what we've done since 2011 is that you'll see in those red stars is our total student enrollment, which is continuously increasing over the last 20 years. I didn't show you all the decades. But for the first time, since we started this in 2011, there's actually been a split where the total number of student absences has gone down for the first time, even though enrollment is increasing. That's brought $25 million to schools in our region just since we started this work in 2011. Again, because it was galvanized by the region looking at what's the impact and how do we monetize that. Here's the last example that I'll give. A lot of when we talk to CEOs and business community, we like to do pop quizzes in terms of things that they might be able to recognize and understand. So we asked them, what's the most conservative way that you can look at the cost of dropouts to our community? If you look at their lost earnings and taxes, what's the most conservative way, meaning those students who are not just lost to the system, but are actually quantified by the state as dropouts? I'll give you 4 choices. It can be what we spent to build our Performing Arts Gallery in the Central Texas region, the Long Center for the Performing Arts. It took us 10 years to raise the money to build the Long Center. Or the gross domestic product of Dominica, if you're familiar with that. Third is Beyonce's 2015 income. She may go up this year with that new album. or the cost of the SpaceX Falcon 9 launch. So A, B, C, or D, if you think of what's one class years of dropouts cost our community, who goes with A? Great Long Center. Okay. B, the gross domestic product of Dominica. Couple of votes there. C, Beyonce's income. I should have told you ahead of time, everyone's supposed to vote C on a multiple choice test, Or who goes with the SpaceX Falcon? Looks like more C or D, or some of those. Okay, well, most of you are wrong. The conservative estimate of the cost of dropouts, again, just to our region over their lifetimes, is $540 million. One class of dropouts. Actually, the GDP of Dominica is closest to that. Our Long Center, that it took us 10 years to build, we could buy 5 of them. Beyonce made just $250 million. 5 Long Centers, or Elon Musk could launch 5 new SpaceXs. 9 new SpaceXs, sorry. So just to give you, again, this is a way to try to help our CEOs think about, how do I put this in context of my community? How do I put it in context of more the global community? And here's the reality, since we've been working on decreasing dropout rates, specifically of our low-income students. Since 2008, since we launched the work of E3 Alliance, we've been able to project that the lifetime earnings of improvements in the dropout rate in the Central Texas region will bring $2.5 billion, because we have improved our dropout rates so drastically in the last 7 years, more so than any other region in Texas. So, $2.5 billion lifetime return is something that we're all looking to be able to look forward to. My bottom line is that regional platform for change in education is possible. I gave you 3 examples: 634% growth in the STEM pipeline, $25 million return from improving student absenteeism, lifetime projection of $2.5 billion in improvements in dropouts that we've made. But you have to base it on objective data and be able to tell the story with data to use it as a platform for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Well, it appears that your E3 model is working and that you have picked up on what Dean Whitaker said, which is looking beyond 3 to 5 years, so much success to all of you. Our next speaker is Mayor Berke from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Mayor Berke is a 1990 graduate of Stanford, and he was elected mayor in March of 2013 with 72% of the vote. So, as those of us that have some political background, we call that a mandate to to fulfill his mission. He has streamlined government. He has focused on public safety, which is something that we have not highlighted yet this morning, but which is truly important when we look at invigorating our communities and our downtowns. So, but the mayor has lots to tell us. Mayor Berke, thanks a lot.
I think part of this portion of the program is just so y'all can listen to our accents. We got North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee now, so try to listen to what we're saying, not just marvel at the crazy accents that we have up here. We appreciate it. So this is my hometown. Last year, Outside Magazine called us best town ever, something that as mayor I'm required to say 3 times in every speech, best town ever. So we got 2 out of the way, only 1 more left to go. And this is what it looks like. Here you're taking a look at our downtown overhead and our North Shore, a place of unparalleled beauty. But it wasn't always that way. And to tell you where we are today, you have to know a little bit about where we've been. In 1969, Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, called Chattanooga the dirtiest city in America. Actually did a special report on CBS News just talking about it. Our air was polluted, our river was dirty, and because we are a valley that's surrounded by mountains, the smoke that billowed out of the stacks that were everywhere in our city just stuck right in the middle of Chattanooga. So the good news was that we cleaned up our air and water. The bad news was that part of the way we cleaned it up was because jobs moved overseas. They went where labor was cheaper, and the industry that we thought was going to last forever was an industry that was gone. So Chattanooga is truly a place that understands the perils of holding on to your past for too long. So what do? We worked hard to rebuild our city, to capitalize on our downtown, and then today we focus on how we make Chattanooga a place for the future. Chattanooga has built a fiber optic network, 600 square miles, that goes to every single home and business in the entire area. I'm going to say that again. Not some homes, not some neighborhoods, not some businesses, every single one. And what that means is that we can deliver not 25 megs of internet, as I assume some of y'all probably get, not even 100 megs, not 1,000 megs, also called 1 gig, but actually today, every single home in Chattanooga and every single business is capable of receiving 10,000 megs or 10 gig of data to your home. So think about it a different way. We have the biggest pipe that you can have to and from the internet, so you can get the most information possible to and from everyone else. Now, what does that do for a city? It can transform your economy. A few years ago, we never would have thought that Chattanooga would have been a bustling place. In fact, when I grew up in Chattanooga, I used to say that it was a great place to take a date because nobody else was there. Now what we've tried to do is to capitalize on our fiber optic infrastructure to really grow our city. Take a look at what we've done. Here you see a picture of our innovation district. Once we have this asset, we've spent the last several years trying to capitalize on it. The way that you do that, in part, is by bringing in every single innovation economy asset as close in as possible, as Jason said, so that they're bumping into each other all the time. We took a spot right at the corner of 11th and Market in the middle of our downtown. We said, this is the centerpiece of your innovation district, and we asked everyone to move in around it. Again, trying to create those collision points so that whether you are a researcher or an entrepreneur or an existing business, you're talking to each other and getting those new sparks and the creative juices going that generate the next new idea. The other thing that we have to do is we have to transform your area so that you get the kind of workforce that attracts, or the kind of workforce that leads to a tech economy in your city. So here you see a new public space in the biggest area of our downtown. This is being done right now as we speak through a combination of public and private funds. Again, those public and private partnerships I know they'll be talking about later, to change this area so that we have open spaces and lots of places for people to meet, and of course music and art, particularly with 2 stages on either end, so that as you have a huge festival, you can see that. And this middle area where you see the tree line, currently that's 6 lanes of traffic where people go about 40 miles an hour. As we transform and streetscape all across, we'll slow down traffic, create those pedestrian connections. This is really important for our community. One of the things that we did 2 years ago was start a tax freeze for people who wanted to build apartments in our area, but also not just we're willing to build apartments, we're willing to make a portion of them affordable. Because we understood that if we're going to have this growing economy, we need to make sure that there are people who can afford to live in our downtown. And then we need to create the public spaces around them so that when they get there, they have something to do. By next year, we will double the number of people living in our downtown that we had 2 years ago. Just an incredible amount of growth. What's the backwards on here?
Red.
Red. So here's what's happened in our downtown. We have spaces like this all over Chattanooga, and we're generating the kind of activity that you want to see. A couple years ago, guys had an idea to start up a new text messaging service where you could text message to restaurants to get reservations. He went to one of our 48-hour workshops. The city generates all kinds of activities for people who are interested in being entrepreneurs, and he walked out of there with $25,000 worth of capital, hired only local people, developed his idea, got about another $200,000 worth of local capital, continued to grow it, partnered with local restaurants so that they could start testing his idea, and eventually sold out about 18 months later to Open Table for $11.5 million. That's big for a place like Chattanooga. What's even more important to me is that now Open Table is growing in Chattanooga. They've doubled their size already, and they're big proponents of our innovation district. In addition, because we have the biggest pipe to get things to the internet, we have a company called South Tree. I tell my kids all the time, there was once a moment in our history where you couldn't take video on your phone. It was a terrible, awful moment in the lives of humans, but it was the case. So when they were born, I had my camcorder and I walked around, stuck a tape in it, and followed them around. Well, now South Tree takes those audio tapes, video tapes, reel-to-reels, whatever that you have, you send it to them, they upload it to the web, and then you get a password, and of course you can see your videos in the cloud and share it with your family. Because we have the biggest pipe in the world that gets the most data up there, they can do that at a higher resolution than any of their competitors. Now South Tree, which started about 4 years ago, has 150 people working in our innovation district. That's the power of the web. We got to spread that as far as possible. The one thing that we are able to do because of the fact that we own our own municipal fiber is to try to spread opportunity. And we really have a chance to do that by making sure that more people are involved in the innovation economy. One of the things that I get the most upset about is that when you say innovation economy, people talk about 24-year-old white guys. And in fact, we know that for our city to be great, we have to get people of color, women, and everyone involved in the economy, because the more people that we get involved, the better ideas that we're going to have. So through Tech Goes Home, which you see here, through our partnership with the White House on Tech Hire, a number of different ways. One of the most important things that we're doing is trying to make a fairer city by ensuring that more people have access not only to the tools of the web, which is how do you turn on the internet, but also how do you use it. So we have NetBridge, so every single person in our school system, every single family who has a kid on free or reduced lunch gets our high-speed broadband network at a greatly reduced price. We now have thousands of young people who have access to our web because of NetBridge. The second thing that we're doing is we're trying to make sure that parents understand how to use the web, do things like get an email address or pay your bills online or set good ground rules for your kid, because again, that grows internet usage in your house. And then the final part I will say is for seniors, the people who you're talking about are scared of using the web, they are the biggest consumers of understanding this because they want to participate in this economy too. So this is not something from the latest George Lucas Star Wars movie or from Narnia or any place else. This is about 10 minutes from my house. It doesn't hurt when you have this in your hometown either. But Chattanooga is a testament to the fact that we can waste what we are given, that if we don't take advantage of our assets, that we can collapse in our downtown, and that for cities and counties to grow, you have to constantly be thinking about the future, and that's surely what's happening in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, Chattanooga truly is a success story and something we can all learn about here in Westchester in the Hudson Valley. Our last speaker on the panel before we go into Q&A is Seth Pinsky. Seth does not have an accent from the South, but Seth and I know each other for quite some time. We worked together in the Bloomberg administration. Seth was the president and CEO of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, where he oversaw the International Applied Sciences Initiative, which brought which is bringing a $2 billion engineering campus to Roosevelt Island. And I think as we talk about kind of what Bill Cuddy said at the beginning, which is We have this great resource, which is Manhattan and the city of New York. How do we balance that with the growth of our small cities here, Yonkers, White Plains, New Rochelle, and how that helps to make this truly a regional economy, and we're not just a bedroom community. And Seth is going to give us his insights. He's now working with RXR Development. They have a great initiative with the city of New Rochelle. So we're looking forward to hearing some of Seth's pieces of advice. Seth?
Thank you. It's always good to be up here in Westchester. My trip was probably the shortest by distance, but may have been the longest by time, coming from Brooklyn as I did. Westchester is a place that I have deep connections with. I was actually born in Yonkers. My family goes back a number of generations in that city. And today we're working on some very exciting projects with the city of New Rochelle. I see some people here from there, as well as with the city of Yonkers, and looking for more opportunities. But what I wanted to focus on this morning was to talk a little bit about what we did during the Bloomberg administration in New York City. And I want to start with some specifics and then expand to a few general lessons that I learned. And just rewinding a little bit, I know all of you here are familiar with New York City, but some of us, I think it's easy for us to forget how different 15 or so years ago was when Mayor Bloomberg came into office. And at that time, you had the after effects of the dot-com bust. You had the World Trade Center attacks and everything that followed from that and that horrible tragedy. And you also had a New York City economy, and this issue is obviously much less significant than the other two, but a New York City economy that was heavily reliant on one industry, on Wall Street. And when Mayor Bloomberg came into office, he said, in the short term, we need to overcome all of these major obstacles that we're facing, but we also need to think long term about how we can better diversify our economy. And the strategy that we landed on was that we decided that the key to the future of New York was to turn it into the 21st century capital of innovation. And the way that we were going to achieve that was through a three-part strategy, and I can go through that very quickly. The first was to focus on quality of life, and I think that this is something that economic development officials often overlook because it doesn't seem, at least at first blush, to be part of their area of responsibility. But I think Mayor Bloomberg really had it right when he pointed out that quality of life is not just what government owes to its people, which it clearly is, but it also is an economic development issue, because if you can attract the best and the brightest to your city, companies will follow them, jobs will follow them, and that's the way that you grow your economy. And so we made investments in lowering crime, and I think that's a story that's very well known across the United States, how New York has now become the safest big city in the United States. We made investments in education, and we made investments in the kinds of amenities that attract the best and the brightest, whether it's parks or cultural institutions. All of these were viewed not just through the lens of good investments for the city because they're civic goods, but also because they were part of our economic development strategy. The second part of our strategy, in order to turn New York into the capital of innovation, was to focus on infrastructure. And the mayor talked about one kind of infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, which is obviously very important. And basic infrastructure is something that cities and regions need to think much more about. Joan gave some really horrifying statistics about how neglected our infrastructure is here in the United States. But in New York City, we made it a priority to continue to invest in our infrastructure, even during times of fiscal difficulty, because we, in this region, I think, learned a lesson better than most people in the United States. We saw what happens when you stop investing in infrastructure. And if you look at what happened to New York City in the 1970s and 1980s, the decision to defray our investment was an absolute disaster. It took us billions of dollars and decades to dig our way out of that hole. And so we didn't just invest in public infrastructure. We expanded the 7 train to the far west side. We created a new ferry system along the East River. But what we also did was we invested in putting in place the conditions that would be necessary for the private sector to invest in private infrastructure. And sometimes I think regions overlook the importance of this, but making sure not just that you have highways and roads and subways and water systems and everything else that the government is responsible for, but that your private sector is also investing. And so we rezoned huge swaths of New York. And today, just last year, we saw a record number of building permits issued in New York City. And the reason for that is not just today's economy, but because of the decisions that we made earlier over the last 10 plus years to put the right zoning regimes in place to allow developers to build when the economy turned around. Now, the last piece of our strategy is a part that I think often economic development officials overlook. And that is not just to think about the physical environment, but also to think about what's going on inside that physical environment and focusing on economic innovation. And there we had a three-part strategy. The first was that we looked at legacy industries, industries in which New York had traditionally been a leader. And we asked ourselves how we could help those industries to transition from 20th century business models to 21st century business models. So a good example of what we did there was we partnered with NYU and Columbia, and we created the first municipally sponsored media lab in the country. And the goal of that media lab was to help the large corporations, which employed so many people in New York, to see around the corner as technology changes were occurring and to make sure that they weren't caught flat-footed, as many of our companies were in the early part of this century, and instead that they were anticipating those changes and making the investments necessary to thrive in that new environment. The second part of our economic strategy was that we looked for areas where New York City had, we believed, competitive advantages, but where it, for one reason or another, hit below its weight. And we asked ourselves, what were the obstacles to New York's being successful in these areas, and what kinds of investments did we need to make in order to help to overcome those obstacles? And so a great example of that is something that I know here in Westchester you're heavily focused on, and that is bioscience. We're the #2 recipient in the country every year of NIH funding for basic medical research, but we have had at the time basically no bioscience industry to speak of in New York. Why was that? And one of the things that we found was that there was a dearth of commercial wet lab space involved. So we made an investment working again with the private sector to build over 1 million square feet of commercial wet lab space, and that's had a dramatic impact on that industry. And then the final piece, and I think this is really important, the final piece of our strategy was to put aside a focus on industry altogether and to ask ourselves what we needed to do to promote entrepreneurship. And the reason why we had a prong of our strategy that was focused on entrepreneurship without regard to industry was because we recognize that governments are traditionally very bad at picking winners and losers. In fact, most of the time when they think that they're chasing the next big thing, what they're actually chasing is the last big thing. And so we decided that the way for us to ensure that the next big thing happened in New York City was to put the tools into the hands of our smart and talented workforce. And what that involved was working with educational institutions to put in place training programs to help people understand what they needed to do in order to start businesses and navigate difficult economic times. We put together a network of business incubators that by the time Mayor Bloomberg left office had hundreds and hundreds of companies in them employing many, many hundreds of individuals. And we also secured capital for startup businesses. Again, partnering with the private sector who has the expertise in investment, but taking government resources and allowing them to allocate those to companies that were starting business in New York City. So all of that was great. We were very excited about our policies, and then 2008 hit. And the economy crashed in New York City like it did everywhere else. And when we looked closely at the numbers, despite some successes, what we saw was that although New York had about 9% of its private sector workforce in Wall Street, about 30% of private sector income was still coming from Wall Street. So we still were heavily dependent. And this wasn't about trying to shrink Wall Street. It was about how do we grow the rest of the economy. And so the last piece of our strategy that I just want to take a minute to talk to you about was what we called our Game Changers Initiative. And in 2008, Mayor Bloomberg turned to his economic development team and said, okay, how are we going to address this downturn? And we kind of looked at each other and shrugged and said, we don't know. It seems to be a really big problem. So what we decided to do was to talk to as many smart people as we could, and we asked them one very simple question. We said to them, if there were one thing about New York City's economy that you could change, that you think would have the most dramatic impact on our economy, what would it be? And we spoke to about 350 people, entrepreneurs, academics, business leaders, community groups, and what we started to hear was a very consistent theme. What we heard was that if you look around the world at the great centers of innovation, what you see is at their core, they have a critical mass of applied sciences, research and development, and talent creation. And though New York has some of the best universities in the world, relative to the size of our economy, and we don't have a comparison to Dominica, the size of our regional economy is the size roughly of Brazil's economy. Relative to the size of that economy, we just didn't have enough of it. And so what we decided to do was to launch a competition, a global competition, saying to universities, if you make a significant investment in applied sciences, research and development, and talent creation in New York City, we will make a capital investment in that project. We will give you free land if you need the free land, and we'll offer you, which might have been the most valuable piece of the package, we'll offer you technical assistance to help you get through all the red tape in New York City. And the result of this was really surprising and very exciting from our perspective. We ended up with 5 winners of the competition. One is a joint venture between Mount Sinai Hospital and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is one of the great engineering schools in upstate New York. Another is a new program that Carnegie Mellon is launching at the Brooklyn Navy Yard dealing with computer-generated animation. Another is Columbia University is nearly doubling the size of its engineering faculty and has started a new engineering program. NYU then, in our 4th program, is partnering with a consortium of international universities, the Indian Institute of Technology, University of Toronto, and other leading engineering schools to create something called the Center for Urban Science and Progress in downtown Brooklyn. And then the biggest project, which Joan alluded to, is a $2 billion campus that Cornell and the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, are building on Roosevelt Island. And as I was driving slowly up the FDR Drive today, I passed the campus. The steel is rising. Actually, all the buildings have topped out, and the campus will be opening next year on Roosevelt Island. And the beauty of this is that altogether, these projects are going to more than double the number of full-time graduate engineering students in New York City. So that's all very exciting. Let me just conclude with a couple of quick observations. You may ask, okay, so which of these initiatives are relevant to Westchester? And the answer is some of them may be, but I think a lot of them probably are not. And this points to what I think is one of the flaws in the approach to economic development of too many regions in the country. And that is that people look around at successful regions and they say, well, I want to turn myself into the next that. I want to be the next Silicon Valley. I want to be the next New York City. And the truth is that what works in one place is unlikely to work in other places. It's like, for those of you who cook, if you use the same recipe but you put in different ingredients, what you end up making probably won't taste that good. Well, I think what is transferable, though, are certain approaches to economic development. So first of all, I think it's important, if you're doing economic development, to be strategic rather than tactical. Our economic development agencies in the United States spend a lot of time chasing individual companies, chasing 100 jobs, 300 jobs. What we realized in New York City was, as important as those jobs and companies are, and they're very important, that in an economy of 4 million jobs, if we spend 6 months chasing 100 jobs, even 1,000 jobs, we have not moved the needle even a little bit. You should be focusing on the business environment. That's really what's key. The second thing is something that I described as part of our strategy, and that is that I think there's a certain edifice complex in the world of economic development. People like to be able to point to things that have been built. And the built environment is extremely important. I work for a real estate developer. Without buildings, you wouldn't have a functioning economy. But you do have to focus on what goes on inside of those buildings. And so economic development strategy should also be focused on trying to foster an innovation economy as well. And then the third lesson is that I think that we spend a lot of time focusing on the cost of doing business in various locations. And tax incentives are something that are talked about as if they are the only tool of economic development. And tax incentives and costs are all very important, and there is certainly a place for those in economic development. But what you have to remember is that when businesses make a decision about location, they're not just focused on cost. They're focused on cost relative to value. And so you can either race to the bottom on cost, or you can focus on raising the value of locating in your region. And if you do that, companies are willing to pay a premium. Again, that's not to say that cost is irrelevant. Cost is very important. It's not to say that we shouldn't ever give incentives to projects. There are times where it is appropriate, but value is just as important as cost. And then my final observations are, one, that process is important, that too often as a region we spend time coming up with answers before we've even framed the questions properly. And taking the time to analyze data and to ask ourselves what we should be asking ourselves is not a sexy activity. It can be frustrating and slow, but it's very rare for people to stumble on the right answers when they're not asking the right questions. And then the final thing that I would say is that it's very important, I think, for economic development agencies to try lots of little things. Pilot, pilot, pilot. Don't spend vast resources. See what works, accept that you're going to have failures, kill the things that don't work, and then scale the things that do work. And I think that we could save ourselves enormous resources if we were just a little more rigorous in our approach and a little more careful in how we spend our money. Not being afraid of failure, but also recognizing where there is success and pumping our resources into those areas. So I'm looking forward to our panel discussion. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Seth. Lots of comments and food for thought. In fact, I'm going to pick up on one of your comments and pose my first question to Jason. When you said, Seth, that it's just as important to look at what's going on inside those buildings as much as building those buildings, and that's exactly what Jason has been doing. So Jason, can you elaborate a little bit on what goes on inside your building and how you attract entrepreneurs to it, and also how you engage your community leaders in building that entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. It really comes down to two things. The first is the physical space itself. It's just a really cool space. It's a place that people want to be. It encourages collaboration. It encourages that bump factor that a couple of us had mentioned earlier. So I'm part real estate developer, and we wanted to make sure there's a cool space. More important to that is the time that we spend connecting to one another, and the time that we spend, well, I guess the time I spend being a people architect, making sure that our tent is full of a lot of resources that's going to help the high impact, high growth entrepreneurs succeed. Perfect example, NC State's in our backyard. Oftentimes universities are siloed. So we got the university to have a satellite campus, both not only in tech transfer and the business school, but also in the design schools and others. And they were siloed within the university, and they hadn't really been working together. So we had this third party that basically went to these folks and said, hey, we really need you. And it's an extremely successful program. And as we expand, they've started with a physical presence in our office. Now I see the chancellor there regularly. I see the deans of the schools there regularly, and they're expanding that greatly. So I think it's opening up the tent. I think the other couple of comments would be corporate engagement, making sure corporations are involved, this whole idea of inclusive innovation and making sure that all different types of communities are involved. So, we provide the physical space and we provide the connections and resources, but we let other organizations come in and provide a lot of that intellectual capital.
And just a quick follow-up. Because we're evolving from a traditional 9-to-5 workforce to 24/7, and as Dean said, most of us at some point in our life will spend part of our time working from home. Is it a 24/7 facility, and how does that work?
Absolutely. So so I'm speaking Raleigh specifically. Currently, it's a 20,000 square foot facility. We have 147 member companies. Obviously, in a facility that size, we can't fit 147 companies there full time, right? So a good deal of those people are part-time workers, or what we call coworkers. where they may be working at home, they may be working out at a Starbucks, they may be working in their office, but they're coming to our place to make those meaningful connections.
Great. Susan, a question for you. You hit on some, I think, very interesting statistics and really hit home the quality of the data and the importance to making your case for making investments. Now, you've had a 10-year time horizon since E3 kicked off. So two-part question. How did you initially engage the business leaders in that process to convince them that this was a good program and a good way of moving forward? And second part is looking at those numbers, what were some of the low moments when you were building up those numbers over the 10-year period, and how did you deal with them both within your organization and to your external stakeholders?
Well, so first I touched a little bit on that when you're embracing this kind of change, you have to lead through influence, not through authority, because it's very unlikely that you'll have authority over all the players that you need to have at the table, including specifically business leaders. So when you're doing that, it's partly about the data, but a lot of it is about building relationships of trust and having the right people at the table. So when we put together our board of directors, we put together literally on the back of an envelope, and one of the things that we said is we have to have business CEOs as part of that, and by the way, they can't all be education wonks, they have to be education cynics, because we need the cynics at the table from the start who are going to help to be the people who say, well, yes, I don't believe we can change education. I don't believe we can create the kinds of outcomes, but let's try. Let's figure out how this fits into the economic development engine that we want to create. And by being part of the solution, they attract more and more cynics, and you turn them around into people who are part of the solution. So that's part of it. As far as the low points of the data, most of what we do, at least when we started out, is very little primary research. Most of what we do is find information that's already out there, but is often hard to find, often conflicting, sometimes purposefully obfuscated by those who don't want you to know where the data is, and take it and make it available and understandable, whether that's to a school district superintendent or a soccer mom or whoever who may say, why do I read a dropout number on the front page of the paper this week, and why does it look totally different than the one I read on the front page of the paper last week, and how do I understand it? So that's a lot of what we do. But interestingly, we've also spent a lot of time over the last 10 years fighting with leaders and agencies in the state of Texas about making data available to make better decisions, because there are a lot of people at in-state government who don't want that information necessarily to be made available. So a lot of the fight that we have is about providing access to basic data to be able to make decisions.
Thanks. I'm going to throw the next question to both Seth and to Mayor Berke. Seth, you talked a lot about what happened in the Bloomberg administration, and we are now seeing the results of those investments. And Mayor Berke, you're right in the thick of it right now, having been the mayor for approximately 3 years. So how do you, when you're both in the middle of it, put some of the political issue aside and guarantee that some of your legacy initiatives come to fruition and not worry about always getting the credit? I think that is something that we hear about a lot today in the political environment, that Congress is always focused on a 2-year time horizon because that's when their reelection is. And I think the lessons from the Bloomberg administration and what we're seeing from Chattanooga is you do the right things along the way, and the benefits are many going forward. So how do you deal with some of those political realities, both in the here and now, Mayor Berke, and then in retrospect, Seth, now that you've a few years out of the Bloomberg administration?
People have political considerations. I'm unfamiliar with that. Listen, I think the first thing to do is like not to say that any of us, anybody who's in elected politics, ever can get politics out of anything. You kind of have to embrace that. That's part of the deal. And if don't believe any elected official who says they've never thought about politics when they make a decision. That's just not right. But To me, the political leaders that I've always admired are the ones who set out a vision and then kind of relentlessly pursued that and figured out the politics along the way. And that's certainly what we try to do. And, you know, all the things that I've talked about, there are countervailing political factors for each of them. We have this municipally owned high-speed broadband. As you can imagine, incumbent providers were not very happy about municipally owned fiber in competition to their products. That's been a huge issue for us along the way. Anytime you start talking about what you do to incent developers to build apartments downtown, then you get people mad, and particularly for us, I know everybody's politics are different, but when you start building out a major portion of public space in your downtown, people in neighborhoods want to know, why is it downtown, not in my area? And then even the last one I'll say is, the Innovation District is a point here and a quarter-mile walk around it, again, to get people as dense as possible, because density really matters. And as I say, whenever you draw a circle, that means only the people who are in the circle are part of it, and everybody outside the circle is not. So you have to, as Jason said, part of getting the politics of all this right is to getting the buy-in from the bottom up. And you got to realize that for us, that's really critical to get the politics right. And if you don't do that, it's all going to collapse under you. So true engagement, listening to people, understanding their needs, their considerations, and really working with that. Here's one of the best examples. When we did the Innovation Center, which is the centerpiece of the Innovation District, my goal was for the city to own it, for us to be the ones that drove the process, and the private sector really revolted on me and got upset about that. And I listened to them and to the people around and figured out, hey, listen, we could do the exact same thing with the private sector owning it by putting out an RFP, making sure that all the things that we want to happen, and in the long run, that's going to be more financially sustainable, because I'm not going to be mayor one day, and the next mayor may not want this, and so we're better off with other people owning this and being part of it. So part of it is setting out the vision, figuring out how you get there, and relentlessly focusing on it, even if that means that along the way, you're going to change your mind, but you're going towards that same ultimate goal.
I wish that my problem in New York had been that we wanted to build things in one place and everyone else said they wanted it in their neighborhood. We kind of had the opposite problem. I think part of how we were able to achieve what we did during the Bloomberg era was a function of who the mayor was. It's unfortunate that you don't see more people, I think, with his approach to government, although you see people up here today with that same approach, but generally in our country, he was a person and is a person who really never did anything because he craved credit for them. In fact, I remember working on a couple of projects where he said, this is a very long time horizon. People aren't going to even realize that we were responsible for this, but it's the right thing to do, so let's do it. And I also remember when we were pushing a more controversial initiative, congestion pricing in Manhattan, when we were making the final presentation to the mayor to get his go-ahead to launch it publicly, he said, we're going to get killed in the public, but it's the right thing to do, and so let's do it. And I just think you don't see that kind of courage among a lot of leadership. Of course, he also has the advantages, he liked to say, of having a better plan B than most people's plan A. So that was also part of it. But I think for all of the characterization of the Bloomberg administration today is a top-down administration that was imposing its will on the larger city. Part of the reason why we were able to get so much done was because we actually spent a lot of time with retail politics and spending time with community groups, listening to people, and that's really at the end of the day, and the mayor told a great story of an example of this, you have to talk to people, you have to engage with them, and you have to engage not just with the people who are in favor of what you do, which is the easiest engagement, but you have to also spend time talking to the people that are opposed to what you do. Because what you find is that, first of all, people just appreciate being listened to. Second of all, you find that there's actually more commonality once the yelling and screaming dies down than you might have anticipated that there was, and there are ways that you can thread the needle. And third, it actually turns out that people who oppose what you do may have good ideas that you hadn't thought of, and you can improve your initiatives by spending time listening to them. And I just want to give one quick example here in Westchester, and we've had an excellent experience in our development work so far, both in Yonkers and New Rochelle, but in New Rochelle in particular, the city put in place a process for the redevelopment of their downtown where they sought a master developer from the private sector, we then followed the process that they proposed, which was to spend a considerable amount of time before even developing our redevelopment plan just talking to people. And more importantly, listening to people. We went to community groups, we sat in people's living rooms, and we all on the team, I think, had some ideas about what we thought the right plan looked like. But in listening to people, we realized that there were important things that we might not have been thinking about. We incorporated those into the plan, and then we put the plan forward after having done that consultation. And as a result of that, in an incredibly short period of time, we were able to secure approval from the City Council in New Rochelle on a unanimous basis in a city where there's a lot of tension on the City Council, but on a unanimous basis for over 10 million square feet of development potential in the downtown. And I think that the reason we were able to do that was because we had taken the time to consult with people, and it wasn't just a, here's the plan, take it or leave it. I think that's a fatal approach to things. That's what we see too much on a national level in this country, and I think that the reason why on a local level we've been more successful is because people actually have to live with one another after the fight is done, as opposed to in Washington where they go home to their district on the weekend and don't have to deal with the people that they're fighting with.
Well, interesting. Susan used the word cynics. You both have used the word the naysayers. And I think we're going to open it up to questions now. But one of the things that I've heard coming out of all of this is oftentimes I use the phrase political will, capital P, and political will, small p. And the political will, capital P, are the Mayor Bloombergs, the Mayor Berkes, the mayors, the county executives, the governors, who are taking the lead with the capital P to pick up where the federal government may have dropped the ball, or where it's just important for the city, the state, the county, whatever the government is. And then what I call the small p political will is marshaling the forces. And you need the capital P political will to set out the vision, but you need the small p political will to have those listening sessions, to drive the process when you make the zoning changes, to work through with the business leaders in the Education Alliance to turn those statistics around, to make those entrepreneurial hubs really work and operate 24/7. So I think you have all demonstrated how you take some of those, what may be open-ended and maybe strong hurdles to get over, and really bring positive results.
Well,
So
Joan, let me jump in.
Sure.
I just want to say, because we talk all the time about the capital P policy and the little p policy,
Aha.
because there are so many things that we expect to have to change laws to be able to enact with the capital P policy, but in fact, very often, if we look for the little p policy changes, it's a lot faster.
Exactly. I used to say to the attorneys that used to work for me, does it say we can't do this in the law? And if it says we can't do it, then we're going to figure out a way to do it and get it done. And that's what each of you has demonstrated here. Questions from the audience? Yes. And if you speak loudly, oh good, we've got the microphones walking around.
Howdy. So I'd like to ask about the role of business and the business in the economic community and interacting with government. Because with the Bloomberg administration, part of it was that Mike Bloomberg came from a business community, so he was attuned to that. Mayor Berke, you and I talked a little bit about that, but I'd like to expand on it. And the other two, in other words, sometimes government is thinking about short-term goals. What do I need to the next election? And what is the role of the private sector in getting government to see that it's advantageous to take a long view and to do long-term strategic planning?
Well, one of the great things about being in a mid-sized city, I don't know what it's like in a place like New York, one of the great advantages is that we can get everybody at the table, literally virtually everybody at the table. And so it's really important for us to spend a lot of time with business leaders. When we started working on technology, we went through a process, and the process started with something called Chattanooga Forward. We set up 6 task forces, all citizen-led, to figure out our next big steps in all these different areas, one of which was gig technology and entrepreneurship that engaged the business community. As part of that, one of the recommendations was that we start a nonprofit that was solely focused in this area. We did that, and that's currently operating today, called the Enterprise Center. And when we did that, we figured out, okay, who needs to be on the board of this organization? It was not government people who needed to be on the board of it. It's business people, leaders in the community who can make things happen, as well as some of the biggest institutions in the education world. So we went through and figured out, okay, who are leaders in the entrepreneurship world, and who are leaders in the existing business world, because we also wanted to create a platform where they were interacting more often, so that people didn't think about there's an entrepreneurship world and there's an existing business world, and those two things are totally different. And so getting them together on a regular basis, we see huge value in that beyond what happens at the Enterprise Center. So, I think that if you have a city like Chattanooga, and there's big differences in scale. We have a set number of employers who are going to have 4,000 or 5,000 people working for them, handful. And then we've got another handful that have 1,000 to 5,000. We can engage them on a regular basis, and we do. It's not that much work, and when you listen to them, you really make a big difference. And by the way, I will say this, just so everybody knows what's obvious, I think, is that businesses also aren't thinking very long-term these days.
Right.
And so government actually has a pretty good role to play in spurring businesses to think more long-term about what they're doing, because we know these investments that are happening can be happening in our community, and talking to them allows them to think about, okay, if this is where our city is headed, what are the opportunities for us for development and to make some capital investments for our business and to grow it? And it should and could work seamlessly, and that's how you grow your economy.
Can I just quickly dovetail on that? I think a lot of times it's just giving corporations a seat at the table and let them be a part of the process. Red Hat is a big player in Raleigh, a big tech company. They want to be seen as a group that's helping to seed innovation in that community. Now, selfishly, it's talent pipeline. Selfishly, it's finding new technologies and them being involved. But we went to them very early on and said, hey, this is our plan, this is our blueprint, this is what we want to do. And we got some of their top executives to sit with us in helping to create this plan, along with entrepreneurs and along with government and educators and others.
Seth?
Yeah, and what's interesting about economic development is that it's inherently a public-private partnership, because it's government's job to create the rules, to create the context, but it's only going to succeed if the private sector is then making the investments, creating the jobs. And I think that one of the mistakes that governments make is, especially in economic development, where what you're doing is setting the table for someone else's actions, is not taking the time to talk to that someone else and finding out whether the policies that you're putting in place are going to encourage them to do what you want them to do or discourage them from doing what you want to do. And again, I'll return to the experience that we're having here in Westchester with New Rochelle. The government officials in New Rochelle have zealously and appropriately guarded the interests of the people in New Rochelle. But I think that bringing a development company into the process as the plan was being developed ensured that what came out on the other end would be something that actually could be implemented. You were talking about the business community in Chattanooga. What I've found in New York was that the business community really cares about these things, and it's their future as much as it's anyone else's future, and they're willing to sit down and take the time. I can't tell you how many Fortune 500 CEOs I was shocked showed up for bad dinners that we would host where we would ask them questions that would help us to develop our policies. But it was such a good investment of time because we learned so much from the experience. And not only did they feel invested in the process, but also we were able to make sure that the programs that we instituted were addressing the real challenges that they themselves feel like they're facing.
Yes. Oh,
Hi.
sorry.
Have a kind of a basic question for Jason. Who's developing these entrepreneurship centers? Who's paying the rent? How does the economic model work for these things so that they can sustain themselves?
I mean, it's a real estate development play, and there's a number of different groups that are doing it. I encourage you to look at American Underground in Durham, which has really helped to transform Durham into an entrepreneurial powerhouse. There's HQ in Raleigh. There's the Frontier, which is like the more modern version of the Research Triangle Park and what they're trying to do to modernize theirs. Essentially, for our model, we charge rent. And there's you basically, it's a membership. You're really not paying rent. But along with your membership comes access to health insurance, free legal advice, access to capital, access to different corporations where you might be able to test out your hypotheses on your product or your service. So really, you're buying into a membership, you're buying into a community, and you're buying to a number of resources. So, where a typical real estate development, let's just say in Raleigh, is maybe paying anywhere from $22 to $30 a square foot, depending on what type of facility you're renting. If I never break this down into square feet or price per square foot for my members, but it's essentially upwards of $90 a square foot. But they're getting access to a state-of-the-art facility and meeting rooms and all these other things that come along with it. It's a turnkey, and it's the flexibility that's extremely important as well. They're not signing long-term leases. We have a number of companies that have come in and they've started with 2 employees, and then 6 months later they're 10. We've got one company, Pendo, right now, just raised $13 million. They went from 2 to 75 employees, and they're really struggling. I'm out there pounding the pavement to find developers that really understand that there's a problem to be solved in some of these high-impact, high-growth companies looking for short-term leases as they grow and scale. I hope that answered your question.
So I just had a comment and a question for our weary traveler from Brooklyn. One of my millennial offspring lives in Brooklyn, and recently we were on the roof of his building, of course without permission, ostensibly to look at the skyline in Manhattan. And I was getting distracted, and what I was distracted about was not what was on the west, but what was on the east. And what was distracting me was agriculture on the roofs of buildings in Brooklyn. And you were talking about quality of life and the economy, and I'm wondering, when you think about food insecurity and how many days worth of food New York really has, and how much money we spend on shipping food, do you perceive this growing part of the economy of New York as something that's measurable and potentially significant?
Yes, I'm not sure that it's ever going to be a large part of the food supply of New York City, although maybe it could be. But at least as current technologies, based on current technologies, it's expensive, and there are issues because a lot of roofs in New York are on older buildings and they don't have the ability to actually hold the weight of the water and the dirt and the produce. But I will say that in my time in the Bloomberg administration, we RFP'd a large former federal warehouse, a 1 million square foot building in Brooklyn, to a developer to turn it into a manufacturing hub. And one of the things that they were going to do, which I think they have done now, is put a rooftop farm on that building. And we actually, in my current employer, RXR, we own a building in Long Island City in Queens called the Standard Motor Products Building, and the entire roof of that building is a farm. And actually we have a cafe on the ground floor that gets a lot of its food from the rooftop farm. So it's certainly something I think that we can see more of, and it's something, I think it's a niche in the economy that's definitely worth looking closer at.
Okay, I think on that note, we're, Bill, sure. We had one back here, and then.
Oh, you have the mic here. We have the mic here.
Mic where?
We have the mic here.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
The lights are in the way, sorry.
in honor of the great American tradition of governors becoming president from Ohio, New York, Texas, California, Georgia, I was wondering if there's a chance that a very progressive, forward-looking, dynamic mayor of Chattanooga, do you have your sights on the governorship of the great state of Tennessee?
Well, I'm happy to say that I'm not running for president in 2016.
You're the only one?
No, so with it, this is, we appreciate it. I think that when it comes to the question of politics, one of the great things about being mayor is unless you do your job right, it doesn't really matter. And so you gotta do your job and then let the rest of the chips fall where they may.
Maybe we could get him to come to North Carolina.
Not that far.
I'm coming, Kim. Somebody's coming, Kim. Seth, I wondered if you could comment about the, sort of the exponential growth in New York City and what it's done to the housing market. I know that the current mayor is now looking at 250,000 more affordable units being needed, and can you talk about the linkages between economic development and housing that the workforce can afford?
Yeah, and it's, so the mayor's plan is for 200,000 units. It's 80,000 new units, preserving 120,000 existing affordable units. What New York is dealing with today is the symptom of its success. The city is growing so quickly in population, the city is growing so quickly in terms of visitorship, in terms of business, that we're unable to match our supply to that growth in demand. And simple economics, what happens when your supply falls behind demand is that prices go up. But that's the opportunity, I think, for Westchester. Because part of the way that we're going to solve the problem of our supply not meeting demand in New York City is by building affordable housing, government-regulated affordable housing. But even if the mayor is 100% successful, which I hope that he is, it represents an increase of single-digit percentages in the total supply of housing in New York. The second way that we're going to do it is by building just more supply generally, whether it's rent-regulated or not. That's an important part of the equation as well. But the third thing that we're not spending enough time focusing on in this region is looking beyond the borders of the 5 boroughs. And the benefit that we have is that people measure distance not by feet or miles, they measure it by time.
Time travel.
They say, not am I close to something, they say, how long does it take me to get to something? And the great advantage that we have because of our transit network in New York is that we have places that are close to the urban core where people want to be that are physically remote outside of New York City. And Westchester has dozens of these places, Yonkers, New Rochelle, White Plains, all along our Metro North line. And this is a huge opportunity for Westchester. It's a huge opportunity for those communities to create a little bit of density around their train stations, to attract the very demographic groups that we heard earlier Westchester is not attracting, to attract the businesses that follow those demographic groups, and to help our region to address the affordability issue. Because if we spread the problem out, if we spread the supply out, it's easier to accommodate it in a way where you can create affordable housing. And I'll give you just one statistic which I think is extremely telling, which is that in New Rochelle, in Yonkers, the market rate housing that we're looking to build on a per square foot basis is less expensive than the highest level of affordable housing in New York City. That's the opportunity we have here, and that's the opportunity that Westchester needs to exploit.
So we're really talking about eliminating the borders and making it one true region.
So two things off of that. Number one is that It's really important to understand that affordable housing really has this link to entrepreneurship and innovation. Because people love to think about innovation entrepreneurs as, you know, the heads of Google. Most of them are running companies that are struggling, and they can't afford to pay their talent very much.
Right.
And so for us to grow, we have to have affordable housing in our downtown because, first of all, they don't want to live far away. They want to live by where they work. And second of all, they don't have a lot of money to do so. So an essential part of growing your economy is to have affordability in there. Second part, and I'll just say for whatever it's worth, is that this is a long-term trend going across the country that I don't think policy leaders are really grappling with, and that is wealth is moving closer and closer in. You're seeing concentrations of people who can afford lots redeveloping downtowns and urban cores. What that also does is it pushes poverty out, which is going to change our country in the long run. And this is something that people aren't really talking about and thinking about on a big scale. It's one of the things that I think over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, our country is going to be grappling with.
And dormitory style living isn't too far-fetched.
That's
if you look
exactly
at
right.
what-
Yep.
I mean, there's different groups. I mean, WeWork is doing an intentional living concept. We've got something called the Think House, where you're making flexible, very intentionally minded housing for entrepreneurial-minded people.
Okay, I think with that, we will wrap up, and I want to thank all of our panelists. It was a great discussion, very lively, lots of lessons learned. Thank you.
That was very nice applause, but it really wasn't enough. I think these leaders, their expertise, their passion, their willingness to share their experience with us. No, I want everybody to stand up. I'm sorry, it's not good enough. That was really great. Thank you.